What else? Wow, 45 minutes. It's going to be a long video. So we are now officially in the first 5 minutes after the time that is set, which is like the grace period for people to actually show up. So, because why would anybody be on time to anything under quarantine? I don't know. So let's see. Oh man, oh my gosh, we're in double digits now, guys. This is incredibly exciting. So let's see. We had a plumber out again yesterday because of the leak in the master bathroom, or allegedly in the master bathroom. They couldn't find it. And my poor wife about lost her mind because the guy's conclusion at the end of the thing was like, well, what we really need right now is we need the leak to get bigger. And my wife is like, wait. That's your solution? Is we just wait until it's more water like spilling out into our master bedroom? And he was like, yeah, pretty much. My wife was not thrilled with that result, suffice to say. And I told her it would be okay. He said something to us like, anytime you leave the house, make sure you turn the water off. And first of all, we're like looking at each other like, when are we going to leave the house? And second, she's like, can you actually turn the water off? I'm like, I can turn the water off for that. Let's see what else. We have thoroughly trained Maisie on how to walk behind that little walking thing. And it's now in the main play area. So like first thing this morning, I just parked her behind it and she started walking laps back and forth. She doesn't know how to turn, but she's very good in a straight line. I'm really just going to kill time until 2:05, and then I'm going to launch into this and get going. And probably 2:05, I'm going to mute everybody that's not already muted, and I am going to take over the screen and walk through a couple of things. So let's see. So what else? What else is exciting? I've got a loaf of bread rising in the kitchen. I'm sure you are all surprised to learn that I am among those people. But yeah, I was just I was sort of, I don't want to say that I was stressed out yesterday, but I think yesterday afternoon I kind of hit the wall again. I've hit the wall pretty much every afternoon for the past week and a half. And so I just decided I needed to bake some bread. So I threw a loaf together and here we are. What else? Trying to think. Okay. Well, it's 2:04. So obviously this is being recorded. If you have questions, toss them in the chat, and I'll get to them. Feel free to interrupt. I'm gonna just start talking, and when you guys find something you've got a question about, hit the chat or whatever. And yeah, I'll answer as many questions as I can as we go through this. So I'm going to start this with the DBQ processing sheet and kind of walk
Hudson,
through. Yes.
before you start, is it okay if we need to leave early to go do things? Is that okay?
Oh, totally. You're not going to offend me. This is it's not an hour-long commitment or a 5-minute commitment. You stick around for what you need. If you need a jet, go for it. Any other questions? Any other things like that before we get rolling? Okay. All right. So I'm going to start with the processing worksheet just because I feel like this does kind of hit the steps that we are going to want to go through. So the prompt. Okay. So here's where we're going to start maybe changing some things from how we would have done it during the school year, simply because we now have the ability, it's open notes, right? And so what we are working on as the WHAP team is this anticipation brainstorming we're going to put together one-page summaries of the major developments and processes from each of the 6 units, so that when you look at the prompt and you identify the time period and the major topic, what we think the next step is going to be is to kind of refer to this index to figure out where you are and what the question is really asking about. Because the reason they're using the DBQ for the entire exam is this is what colleges wanted to see as far as evidence of your understanding of history. And it's that understanding of history part that I think is going to be important, especially with sourcing, especially with outside evidence. And ultimately, of course, if anybody's aiming at complexity, it's that you understand where the question fits into, well, you understand the history of the question itself, so the specific topic, but also you kind of understand where the thing fits into history overall, right? And so if you watch that video I did on connecting the 20th century, that's kind of the idea that I think I'm getting at, is this idea of whatever they pick for the DBQ. So the DBQ you guys are writing this week is 19th century railroad building and empire, right? And so the 1800s as a time period, and imperialism in the 1800s fits in a process that started back in 1200 and continued through the 20th century, right? So that DBQ is one slice of this long threaded process. So in the beginning of the DBQ, as quickly as possible, because it's still just 45 minutes to write a DBQ, I want you guys to take a moment to figure out where the question fits in a broader, into broader history. And so let me show you what this looks like. Okay. Can everybody see a Unit 4 events, developments, processes thing now? Okay. So this is kind of what we're working on. We're still playing with formatting and stuff like that. But this is all of, hopefully, this is all of Unit 4 in one page, right? So if the DBQ is about trading post empires, like that Portugal DBQ, right? Then we could locate it here. Okay, Spain, Portugal. Oh, okay, Portugal arrives in the Indian Ocean, right? So we're looking at technology, we're looking at economics, and then what we're going to work on, what I haven't finished yet, is if we take that European exploration, okay, what are some of the things that came before it? What are the things that connect to it afterwards, right? So that kind of helps you fit it into that broader thread of history. That's going to help with contextualization, and it should help you when you're analyzing things like sources. I've read some of your sourcing. I'm going to do a thing on sourcing, and we can talk about sourcing today. But I think what it's missing a little bit is that the specificity of how that source really fits into things. And our hope is that we're going to make these little quick guides, and we're going to put these together. We're not going to ask you guys to do this. But these will be quick guides, and then those the Heimler outlines or questions should be more specific. So it's kind of like, here's the prompt. I figure out from the prompt, like, what's my big picture development or process? So then I would find it, and then that is going to take me. If I'm looking for outside evidence, it takes me to my specific notes. I know I'm going to look in my Unit 4 notes, and I know I'm looking at like 4.1 and 4.2, right? So as quick a process as possible to get you from the prompt to whatever you might need for contextualization and outside evidence. Which I'm probably going to need to reformat this. The great thing about this being open notes is you guys can use aids like this. What I would suggest on the test day is to print this stuff, because we don't know what their weird alleged security thing is going to look like. And we're worried that accessing documents at the same time as other kids could flag you as collaborating, you know? So having as much of the stuff either downloaded as PDFs or just printed would be useful. So I'll reformat this later. But so we figure out the prompt, we know what time period it is, we know what it's asking about, we think about what do we know about the time period, which helps us with context, okay? And then we're ready to run through documents. As you're reading the documents, you're always looking for, how does this document help me answer the question? So you're not just reading aimlessly, you're looking at the sourcing to see how it relates to the question, you're looking at the evidence in the document to see how it relates to the question, and then you're noting that. Sorry, people are kind of popping in and out. Okay, so once you've read through the documents, then it's time to group. We're going to assume on a 5-document essay that you're only going to need 2 groups, that you're probably not going to aim for a third group. With 5 documents, you can, of course, especially if you feel like a document can be used in multiple ways. And it's the description of the group that I think is key here. Once you have that description, that is going to help you with your thesis. Okay, so we've got groups. We know what documents we're going to use and what evidence we're going to use from the documents. We're trying to get through that in 10 to 15 minutes. 10 would be ideal. 15, you might have to hurry a little bit, but 10 or 15 minutes, we're looking to have our groups so that we can start writing with contextualization. There's 2 parts. Remember, broad historical description with specifics wherever possible. So name names, if you can. Years, less necessary, but names, if at all possible. And then that direct connection to your thesis. Okay, so whatever you talk about here, you have to be able to fit here. Now, I'm going to spoil this for you guys since you're here today, but a kid in my 4th period class in contextualizing the economic positives and negatives of globalization talked about Christopher Columbus, and he also, the kid straight up said, sailed the ocean blue, and the kid talked about the 3 Gs. Now, what class period was this kid from, you might ask? He was from 4th period. Is this a kid I've talked about before in the other classes? Yes. And when I thanked him so I didn't mean to turn off screen sharing, but whatever. When I thanked him for talking about Christopher Columbus, he didn't understand why I was thanking him. But it's totally going to be in, I'm gonna go back through, I've got a presentation with a bunch of comments on stuff from last week's practice, and he's gonna be in that video, because you can't contextualize late 20th century globalization by talking about Columbus. There is a thread there, but you've got to get from Columbus to the 20th century. And that the kid didn't do. Okay, so that's where this second part, this direct connection to a thesis, has to happen. And the closer your context is to your thesis, the easier that connection is going to be. So we recommend no more than 100 or 200 years as far as a radius around your thesis for contextualization. And of course, you can also contextualize in the body of your essay. And this is where, depending on the time period of the essay, I talked about that 20th century stuff could be useful, because as you get into the body of your essay, you could have a line of reasoning here that really directly leads to something in the 20th century. Like if you're talking about industrialization, you could talk about the massive military growth in the late 1800s, early 1900s that led to World War I. That is technically contextualizing your evidence and your line of reasoning. Okay. Now, thesis. If you watch Heimler's video before or after you write the DBQ this week, he is going to use that formula. The formula is fine if you feel like you have a counter argument. So if you feel like whatever your argument, these 2 groups are, if you did see something else in the documents that kind of contradicted these 2 groups, then you can use the formula. And that is basically, you say your counter argument, well, this happened. However, or but as well, here's the main impact of the thing and here are the two ways I'm going to prove that. Okay, so if you watch Heimer's video and you see that counterclaim formula, that's great. It's not necessary. If you want complexity, use the formula. If you just want to get a thesis point, just make your claim and list your lines of reasoning. Okay, simple, simple. Address the question with a claim, and then give your lines of reasoning. Okay, so Nikita asks, if we want to address the counter argument later on in the DBQ, can we use docs as evidence? Absolutely. You can use the document multiple ways, of course, and using it multiple ways does demonstrate a complex understanding of the documents, right? You can see that the same document both supports your argument, but also maybe refutes it or modifies it, I think is the language the College Board uses. So yeah, if you don't want to put it in your thesis, you can still come back and do that in your body paragraphs for sure. Now, if you do that, so let's say you write a very straightforward thesis, you do counter argument in your body paragraphs. At the end, in your conclusion, I would rewrite your thesis to include the counter argument. So this is like, let's say you stumble into the counter argument as you're writing, right? Just make sure to include that in your concluding thesis or restatement of the thesis to really hammer home that you understand, hey, here is a counter argument that I discussed. Okay, so questions as we're through here, because this is really like, if you've gotten to this point with the documents, you're pretty much good to go for 4 or 5 points pretty easily at this point, right? So any questions on getting to your thesis, about grouping, about thesis statement, any of that stuff? Did everybody watch my dumb video on grouping? I mean, it's pretty good.
Yes, it was.
Yay, one person watched. I plugged it on the AP World Facebook group. So
Nice.
Yeah. Okay, so grouping. Grouping incorrectly. I don't it would reflect. Okay, sorry. So you don't have points taken off ever, right? You only have points added. So if you are using the documents incorrectly, so like you put one document in a topic where it doesn't belong, that's just going to hurt you getting the points for supporting your argument, because the evidence from that document doesn't support that argument. So it would hold you back from getting that point. Now, if you come back and use that same document later to correctly support your argument, you can still earn that point. Okay. The limit here is your time. You know, I know a lot of you guys, if I gave a quiz and you had 90 minutes to take this quiz and it was, you know, open-ended, you might give me 5 things instead of 2, right? You can totally do that on the DBQ. The problem is you're going to run out of time, right? So you want to be efficient and accurate. So you don't want to put a document in a group where the evidence doesn't really go. But if you do that, you're not going to be penalized as long as you come back and use it correctly later, if that makes sense, Sahan. Any other questions about grouping or about thesis stuff before we move on? Okay, So Amita asks, let's say you take the circumstance that I just gave. So let's put it in a DBQ context. You have 3 lines of reasoning, and 2 of them are supported by the evidence. 1 of them is incorrect. Would you get points off? No, I think they would give you credit for the 2 that are correct, unless that 3rd one somehow. Well, I think what you would. I think they're going to give you credit for what you do correctly. Yeah. The problem is if you are doubtful on anything, whatever that weakest group is, whatever you think is extra, put it last, right? Do the stuff that you feel more sure about first. Anything that you're kind of taking a chance on or you feel less sure about, you're just throwing it in there to see what happens. Do it last. I think it's the same principle as you would take on any timed writing. Write the stuff you know first, write the stuff you don't know last, because you might not get points for it anyway, so just shovel it off to the end. So no, there's no harm in doing extra. It's just it just takes time. So any other questions on that? Did that make sense, Amita?
Yeah, that made sense.
All right, cool. Okay, so let's talk about body paragraphs, and this is where we're going to get into now something that's not on here, which is sourcing. Okay, so you guys understand pretty clearly topic, sentence, document, evidence, explanation, right? So claim, evidence, response type stuff. And then evidence beyond the documents, now you're going to want it to be the same kind of evidence that you would have found in the documents, right? So that same level of a British dude in Africa in the late 1800s did this thing. And that is further evidence that the British wanted to, whatever your thesis, your line of reasoning is, right? It's got to do these 2 things the same as evidence from the documents would, right? So you've got to give me facts and description, and then you have to tie it into your argument and talk about what it proves from your thesis. Okay. If you just throw a random fact out, you're not going to get that outside evidence point. Okay. So again, it needs to be treated the same way you would treat evidence from the documents. So these 2 steps, identifying and describing what your evidence is, and then talking about how it proves your thesis, you would do it the same way. It's now 1 point per, so you get 2 shots or more. You can always do 3, of course. This is that extra bit again. If you do it 3 times and 2 of them are correct, you should get 2 points. If your 3rd one's wrong, whatever. It doesn't count against you. Any questions about outside evidence? If it is relevant to your argument, it supports your thesis. Your thesis is your argument. So yes, needs to tie to your thesis. Everything needs to be tied to your thesis. Can it disprove or weaken? If you're going for that complexity point, if you are saying, well, here's something to consider, while most of the time this thing functioned in this way, however, sometimes, sure, you can use evidence that's still, so the College Board wording is refute or modify your argument, right? So yes. So I see what you're asking there. Yes, if it's something that disproves your thesis, that's okay, right? That's complexity. You just still have to be able to back up the that your argument is stronger than this little refutation or modification. Okay, so Nikshita, think of the planning document as just like I would not fill in this page, right? This is just for me to be able to like frame it in my head. We use these at the beginning of the year when we weren't actually writing the paragraphs, right? I would just keep this in front of me as like almost a checkbox to say, okay, did I describe the evidence? Yes. Did I talk about how it supports my thesis? Yes. Okay, cool. Right? Because you don't have time to write it twice. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, just think of it as, yeah, it's like a checklist. Like, so you just cross it off and say, yes, I did this. Yes, I did this. Like this could even probably be summarized down in one line and just says, for each document, do this. For evidence beyond the documents, do this. So yeah, I'll play with the format a little bit because yeah, you're right. You're not going to fill this whole thing out and then start writing. Even in the quarantine, we don't have time for that. Other questions about body paragraphs before we talk? I'm saving sourcing because we're gonna talk about that separately here. Okay, if you have questions about body paragraphs or evidence, stop me. I'm going to talk about sourcing. Okay, so this document runs through the College Board outline, and I'll probably share this document at some point. It may be in the document or the DBQ stuff essay folder already. May not be. I'll double check. So sourcing. For one document or two documents, you explain how or why the document's point of view, purpose, historical situation, and or audience is relevant to an argument. Now, it's not and, it's definitely or, okay? If you do one of those four things twice correctly, that's 2 points, okay? They do often tie together. Like when you're doing intended audience, often you'll wind up talking purpose. Sometimes when you talk purpose, you'll talk historical situation, point of view and historical situation are often connected, right? So that's why it's and or. So, so for this, you want to say, well, okay, what you're doing, this is historian work, right? This is us looking back at the text evidence and saying, okay, I wasn't there as a historian myself personally, so I have this piece of evidence here from this source. Okay, I can tell you how the person writing the source, how their point of view would affect the information that they included, right? So if we're talking 19th century and we've got some European person talking about not white people, you know, we would talk about racist, social Darwinist attitudes and how Europeans look down upon them. So that's probably why, or that could possibly impact the evidence we have here, because this person assumes Africans are not people, right? Because they're racist European during a period of time where that was a widespread, widely held point of view. Okay, so you explain how or why it's relevant. Okay, and you're good. Okay, so like that was point of view. Okay, when we talk about purpose, that's often we're looking at, and this is why I say purpose and audience often go hand in hand. This is thinking about why was the document produced? Okay, what was the occasion that caused the document to be created? So it's a government document. Well, governments produce reams of data because they've got bureaucrats running around who need work, and you know, charts, especially sometimes when you get a document that says, you know, Indian government official or whatever, report to certain department. Like there was that the document 7 from the globalization DBQ was to the Australian Labor Ministry, I think. Right. And so you had a government official talking to other Australians. And what is the conclusion of that document? Well, hey, we're not part of the problem. We are the solution. Well, of course, you're going to tell other government ministers of your own government that, hey, we're the good guys here, because nobody ever thinks of themselves as the bad guy. Right. Audience, who was it produced for? Purpose, why was it produced? And then you're discussing it, right? You're giving us an analysis. You don't have to then turn around and say something. And I think a lot of history teachers are cautioning kids about this. You're not using this to say the source is biased or the information is credible, right? That's what I think kids have done for a long time. And usually the problem with this is that as soon as they say something like the document is credible because they're an Australian government official. And that's not enough to earn the point, right? Because you're not explaining how being a government official impacts anything. You're just identifying that it is a government official. And this is, the verb is explain. So you just need to say, and usually you can do this in a sentence, an Australian government official, and this is, I think, kind of where literary analysis, this is where your English class might help some, because you are, at this point, you're really looking at the text, and you're trying to tie something from the document to this point of view or audience or historical situation, right? So when the Australian government official says that European processes are part of the solution, this reflects the fact that he thinks highly of his own job and purpose. I mean, that's what he does, right? So that's kind of how you would explain that. Now, my goal this week, and I haven't gotten to it yet, is to walk through each of these 4 things and give a sort of bad analogy for it, and then explain how that's useful. So we talked about point of view, talked about audience and purpose a little bit. Okay, historical situation. And I actually did kind of talk about this with that, point of view. So think about, historical situation is it's the context that someone exists in, right? So why are kids sitting on their devices at home all the time right now? Well, it's not because you're lazy. It's not because you're bad kids. It's because we're under quarantine, right? So you can't separate the situation we live in from the way people behave, okay? So your goal if you do historical situation, is to find a source where you know the time period well, and you can say, or the place well, and you can say, well, at this place, at this time, this is what was happening. So that's why this person said it this way or believed this thing or whatever. Okay. The example I think I'm going to talk about from that globalization DBQ was I think it was document 3. They were talking about globalization and these new jobs and the call centers and customer support stuff. I think it was 1997 was the year of that document, and I remember 1997 because I was in college. I actually. Oh, this is my 1996 college yearbook. That was me in 1996. Anyway, in 1996 and 1997, the internet was like brand new. And so that article, the historical situation that article came up in was, wow, look at this new thing. Look what it's doing. If you read the document, it's very neutral. It says, well, we don't know if it's going to be good or bad because, of course, you don't, because the historical situation was the beginning of that process, right? It's very different than us looking at it in 2020 and everybody, well, not everybody, but certain people saying things like, well, we shouldn't manufacture things in China, right? That this COVID-19 proves that we should have all our manufacturing here in the United States so we don't have to rely on other countries. Okay. Well, that's cool. You can say that now because hindsight, right? But you wouldn't have been able to say it in like the 80s and 90s when we started shifting manufacturing overseas because you didn't know the long-term impact. Is historical situation contextualization? Only if you're talking about it in absence of, like in general. And a thing can't count twice. So if you're talking about a historical situation as it relates to one specific document, that's sourcing. If you're talking about the historical situation generally in the paragraph and you're relating your line of reasoning to other processes happening at the same time, then that's contextualization because you're talking about, so there's like, it depends on, I'm trying to think how to kind of explain this. I'm going to draw a picture. Okay, so let's say that we're looking at this direct line, right? Starting with your argument, evidence sits directly under your argument, right? So if you're going to talk about the historical situation of the evidence, then that's directly in line and tied to your argument, right? It's in that line. However, if I talk about contextualization, context is like one step away from my argument, right? So, okay, I'm going to use that really terrible example we looked at a long time ago with the Columbian Exchange DBQ or LEQ. I think it was the LEQ, where that kid wound up talking about pizza at the end of his essay and the College Board considered it contextualization. That's because, well, pizza as a product was something that diffused to the Americas from Europe, which is related, but it happened after Columbus did. It happened after the period we consider the Columbian Exchange from like 1492 to like 1600 when the initial wave happened, right? Pizza's 400 years later. So historical situation as it relates to a document is directly in line and relates to one of your lines of reasoning. Contextualization then is just outside of it. It still should connect, but it's not, you're not explaining your argument. Does that make sense?
Yes, yes, it does.
Okay. What else on sourcing? One of the main keys, I think, to sourcing, guys, is finding documents that have good points of view or good audiences or purposes, because something should jump out of you about the source that you feel comfortable talking about and you want to use. You don't want to do it on just any document, and you don't want to do all 4 things on every single document, right? Nobody's got time for that. You want to look at the sourcing and find something kind of juicy that sticks out, that is one of those 4 things that you know you can explain well as it relates to the document. And you don't have to do things like this makes it biased or this makes it like less credible. You're just explaining, here's why he would say that. And that's it. Okay. So yeah, here's that thing. Uses evidence to corroborate, qualify, or modify an argument. Qualifying an argument means, okay, this is true most of the time, but sometimes it's not true, right? And so that would be where, if you had evidence from beyond the documents that says, okay, well, this is generally true, but here's an exception. That exception as evidence beyond the documents could do a lot of work for you. What else? What haven't I covered about DBQs? A lot of people whose names start with A here today. Okay, so one thing when you're writing this, and I'm not sure if this will help or not, but whenever you're writing this, bear in mind that you are not, don't assume that the person reading your essay knows anything. Assume that they are like your younger brother or sister or your clueless friend, right? So you do want to, when you say trading post empires, sometimes you do want to spell it out, like that, because it demonstrates that you understand it. It may feel wasteful, but it also makes it very clear to the reader that, hey, I know what I'm talking about, you know, and especially if it helps to clarify something from your argument. And if you find yourself explaining things, make sure you're thinking in terms of causation, continuity change over time, or comparison, right? So if you're giving more detail on the effects or causes of a thing, cool. Those are words that are helpful and useful to you when you're writing your essay. If you're just giving basic facts and information, that may not help. Okay, counter argument, you can do it a couple of ways. You can do counter argument at the end of a paragraph, right? If you have a specific counter argument for that specific part of your line of reasoning, you could do it at the end of the paragraph. If you've got a counter argument that is as big as one of your other arguments and you have evidence to do it on its own, then it can be a third body paragraph where you just focus on your counter argument. If you know you're going to do that, try to amend it or make sure it's in your thesis statement in the beginning, and then at the very least make sure you include it in your conclusion at the end. And I'm guessing since you're typing, it'll be a lot easier. If you're typing, you don't have to type, but if you type, it should be a lot easier to go up and change your thesis to tag a counter argument into your thesis And honestly, truly, if you have time, when you're done writing the body, I would go back and look at my thesis and make sure that my thesis fits what the rest of the essay is saying, if that makes sense. Oftentimes what we'd actually recommend if you're writing this paper as a paper is we'd recommend you just write your thesis last, like write the body first, then go back and write your thesis. And that may be a worthwhile approach when you actually write the DBQ. I think in the time situation, we say do it first because it is a point all by itself. And you want to make sure you get that point. But as far as counter arguments, yeah, it could be at the end of a paragraph when it's specifically addressing a line of reasoning, or it could be by itself because you have enough evidence and things to give it its own body paragraph. Does that help the people who've asked questions?
Yep. That makes sense.
Okay, so how do I include a counter argument in my thesis? Okay, so you can find anywhere, if you type WHAP thesis formula, it'll give you the, I don't know what it is. It's like A period, however, because X and Y, whatever. But yeah, it can be as simple as saying what's a DBQ written? The silver trade had positive effects on the Spanish economy and something else. However, it also destroyed the Chinese economy, right? So you can do the formula puts the counter argument in front, and then you contradict the counter argument with your main argument and your lines of reasoning. But there's nothing stopping you from laying out your claim first and then saying, however, and here's my counter argument. So you can go both directions. But yeah, it's real easy. Heimler talks about the DBQ formula and counter arguments in his video. So you can definitely check that out. And I think I put a link to that in the DBQ stuff folder on Schoology.